So welcome everyone to our webinar, a conversation about patient-partner outsider syndrome, uncovering nuances from the, now I'm going to say PAN, Patient Advisors Network, known as PAN, Reimagining the Research Landscape report. And I will be your moderator for this session. I'm Maureen Smith. I'm a patient partner from Ottawa, and we are recording the webinar and we'll post it on the OSSU website. We also have a virtual note taker and are saving the chat. And I am going to hand it over to John Riley to do the land acknowledgement.
Thanks, Maureen. We acknowledge that OSSU is located on the lands we now call Toronto, and that OSSU operates across Ontario, which is home to many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples from across Turtle Island. Toronto is on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples, and is covered by Treaty 13 signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are deeply grateful to the generations of people, past and present, who have tended this land and acknowledged the abiding wisdom of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty to share and care for it. As settlers, we are thankful for the opportunity and privilege to meet and work here. We seek to move forward with humility, respect, gratitude, and meaningful relationship building.
Hey, thank you, John. We are going to start with two quick polling questions to kind of get an idea of who is in the audience. So John is going to put those up for us.
If I may, there are 3 questions. You can scroll down the survey to get to the questions 2 and 3 if you don't see them. Just a few more seconds to finish the poll. Now I'll share the results.
Understandably, OSSU, lots of people from Ontario, but wonderful to see people from other provinces too. The hats. Well, we have a lot of patient caregiver partners. That's great. Okay, research trainee. Wow, that's pretty nice. Okay, so interesting. Got a kind of a nice variety of people. And okay, that's great. 53% have a lot of experience. So there's also a variety of experiences. It's going to make for a very interesting webinar, and interesting when we get to the question and answer period too. Okay, so the presenters, the 6 panelists will introduce themselves when they first speak. So when I call on them to speak, they will first introduce themselves briefly. And so I'm not even going to name them now, because by the time I'm finished naming them, you probably have forgotten who the 6 of them are. I'll let them come on and introduce themselves. And we will have time for Q&A at the end of the presentations, but please put your questions into the chat as you think of them, as they are, as the conversation is going. This is really meant to be a dialogue. There will only be slides at the beginning from Elise to set the context. After that, we've got almost an hour for this breaking down the silos dialogue that we're hoping to have. So we're hoping that you're going to really enjoy that, and that's all. I'm going to keep the rest for surprise, but I am promising an interesting conversation, maybe some topics that we don't address all the time in patient partnered research. So I'm going to hand it over to Elise, who's going to start us off with a few slides.
So
Okay.
thank you very much, and thanks to ASU for supporting this ongoing conversation. I'll just pull up my slides. Where do they go? There they are. And I'll go to the presentation mode. Can everybody see that?
Yeah.
John, are my slides visible?
Perfect, Elise.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, so we'll start then. I'm really delighted to be here today to talk about our project, Reimagining the Research Landscape, and the implications for patient engagement. This was a report commissioned by CIHR, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, from us, PAN, for their strategy refresh of SPOR after 10 years. So I'll introduce myself. My name is Elise Maybe. I'm a longtime patient caregiver partner and the co-chair of PAN. And since 2011, I've collaborated in all aspects of healthcare in Canada, practice improvement, policy creation, and of course, research. I've been asked to summarize the key elements of our report and focus the discussion. So that's what we'll do now. CIHR asked us to provide insights and information from our community of patient caregiver partners about their experience in research. And specifically, we were asked to provide a PAN representative for the steering committee, which we did, Diana Ermel, and she became the co-chair of the National SPOR National Strategy Refresh Advisory Committee. She was supported internally by our PAN council for the project, which was 4 additional people. And this team created a detailed survey in English and in French, to which 262 people in our community and beyond replied, over Christmas, no less. We also did 2 focus groups. And in the end, the value that we brought to CIHR was, in a nutshell, threefold. First, we were able to reach people who were not involved in research, and CIHR had no way of reaching those folks. So we were able to talk to people who are outside that. Second, the responses that we got were frank because they trusted PAN and they knew their responses would not jeopardize their relationships with researcher colleagues. And finally, the responses we got were really deeply grounded in experience. I'll start with some quotes from our respondents. Many of us feel this way. The survey data showed that most people, around 50%, were comfortable speaking up in meetings and expressing opinions. However, significantly fewer felt their contributions were listened to or acted upon. A large number of our respondents also expressed an extreme range of experiences, from complete tokenism to feeling respected and like a full team member. So many of us have had all of these experiences, the whole range. There's no consistency in our experiences across engagement as a result. The degree of involvement and the type of experience we have is often usually shaped by the researchers themselves, who have varying levels of experience in patient-oriented research. So training and mentoring for researchers helps support better involvement. So I'll start at the beginning of our report. We were able to reach, as I said, patient and caregiver partners not yet involved in research, but interested. We learned that many of us are actually not aware that research is something we can be part of. Basically, you don't know what you don't know. And when we are aware of research, we learned there's a lack of clear roots in, which excludes a variety of people and perspectives. Basically, we get involved in research through word of mouth. who we know. And this has led to the favored few being called upon time and time again. We conclude that the research culture is internally focused and does not think about how people from the outside learn about research and how to get involved. It also relies heavily on the researcher's personal relationships with individual patient and caregiver partners. From an inclusion perspective, this means that most of us in the know, the favored few, make up the bulk of those of us patient caregiver partners in research. The lack of clear roots in really excludes the variety of people and perspectives. So we suggested, but we're up for discussion today, that researchers and funding agencies widen the door and make it easier and more obvious for how people can get involved. And we also suggested that we need to think about developing relationships that span projects and are not dependent on projects where a relationship could end at the end of the project. The academic world values credentials, PhDs, publications, and the like. By that measuring stick, patient caregiver partners are usually at the bottom of the heap. We don't often recognize these embedded cultural views as a bias. The focus in research is on data collection and analysis. The transactional and time-bound nature of the research grant cycle flies in the face of developing and building long-term trusted relationships. Patient caregiver partners are often valued solely for their health condition, and they're seen more as a data contributor to the discussion rather than someone who has insightful perceptions based on their deep experiences both with the healthcare system and their personal management of their condition. We bring more than that with our life and work experiences that frame our patient and caregiving experiences. So I'd love to discuss that further. One suggestion we had is you leave your introductions at the doorstep and introduce yourself as a human being with an interest that's shared. And we focus on what is shared between us as human beings.
Oh, nice.
Patient engagement in research traditionally has really focused and emphasized individual researchers and teams with training and requirements for action. However, the teams don't operate in isolation, and they often don't have agency for some of the thornier issues around engagement. So teams are really at the micro level. At the macro level, we have funding agencies like CIHR and OSU who provide training and support along with grant funding. They also provide the criteria around patient engagement that teams must adhere to, and hopefully also accountability. At the meso level are the fund holders, usually universities or academic hospitals, but sometimes industry or governments. And they are left out of the discussion about supporting patient engagement by and large. Yet their legal and accounting policies impact the mechanics of compensation and reimbursement. So their policies can really help or hinder our participation. So I'm looking forward to having some discussion with the researchers about what can be done about that, if anything. Hopefully lots. The most astounding finding came from our questions about bias, especially in the text comments. We anticipated responses related to biases based on aspects of identity like gender or race or education, culture, and so on. But what we got was a large number of responses along the lines of, quote, I don't know if this is a bias, but I feel like an outsider because I am a patient, end quote. That was incredibly often that we saw that, and it surprised us. In our analysis of the data, we concluded there is one basic research work culture, but patient caregiver partners come from a wide range of work and social cultures. but the onus is on us to adapt to the dominant research culture. And this contributes to our feeling like outsiders. So we had some suggestions, but I'd love to, get into the discussion about this further. We need to recognize the cultural challenges for us as patient partners and the implicit power imbalance that comes because of that. We also need to embrace the unease that comes from this and open discussions and not be afraid of the difficult discussions because those lead to growth, innovation, learning, and change. We also need to park assumptions and talk to people as people. Quote, no one ever seems to ask me for anything concrete. When I ask why, I'm told it's because we don't want to overwhelm you, end quote. That's really frustrating because it doesn't allow us to make the decision. Reach out to patient caregiver partners and communities that you are not familiar with for a richer variety of insights. And don't fear the unknown, but embrace the learning and growth that comes from opening up and being vulnerable. So I'm going to sort of close this off with two more quotes that epitomize the feeling of being an outsider. So last year in November, when I presented this on our poster to NAPCRG, researchers that I was talking with were aghast at the eye roller comment and questioned if this was true. So ironically, there were 3 patient caregiver partners whom I'd never met who happened to be listening, and they jumped in and vehemently agreed with the eye roller comment. So eye rolling is definitely a thing. On that odd note, I'm going to pass it back to Maureen to facilitate the rest of this discussion. And thank you for listening.
So thank you so much, Elise. So much food for thought here, and huge kudos to Pan for making sure that not only the usual suspects filled out the survey and participated in the focus groups to get a wide range of people to actually, get this data and analysis that is reflective of what's happening in the community. So yeah, and thank you for your presentation. It's just wonderful. Okay, so that set the stage. That's the end of the slides, people. No more slides. We had a pre-meeting, and I said to our 6 panelists, okay, can we just have a frank, honest conversation? Can we break down some silos and talk to each other, and just get some of this out there and in an open discussion? And they said yes. So I was really happy about that. So this is unscripted. We worked together on some of the questions, but it's really an unscripted, frank conversation. We hope that you're going to enjoy it. I'm going to start by asking Annette and Sandra, in that order, to introduce themselves briefly and just to tell us, to start the ball rolling, is there one highlight from the survey findings that that you'd like to comment on, either because it surprised you or just that you would just like to take a little bit of a deeper dive into? So I'm going to hand it over to Annette to start us off. Don't forget to introduce yourself. And this is the beginning of our moderated discussion.
Well, thanks very much, Maureen. I'm Annette McKinnon, and I'm a co-founder of the Patient Advisors Network. Over the past 12 years, I've been working for change in healthcare and as a member of research teams involved in guideline development, patient engagement, priority setting, scoping reviews. The quotes Elise mentioned from our report made me think of an early experience, which is sort of a multifaceted look at issues. The first team meeting I was invited to was held in person downtown. But when I arrived, I couldn't find them because they changed rooms while I was on the bus. So I arrived late and I was introduced to the group, but they weren't introduced to me. So with my one piece of paper that had been sent to me before the meeting, compared to the piles of folders everyone else had around the table, I felt that I didn't belong there, The only contact name I had was the primary investigator, and I was actually reluctant to email them since I thought I had to go through the proper channels. So discussing the topic which could benefit patients like me was easy, but when I asked them, what are you doing about the biologic samples? They weren't worried, even though I thought, since I'd just taken the module, that informed consent procedures needed to be itemized. So I felt sorry that they weren't ultimately funded. And one of the reasons, unfortunately, was weak patient engagement. So I felt it was my fault. So when I think about patients in research, I can still see myself at the table with my one piece of paper that I felt right then marked me as not like them. So Sandra, I'm done. Thanks.
Thanks, Annette. My name is Sandra Holsworth, and I'm a member of PAN. I have 40 years of lived experience. I have over 30 years of being an advocate for organ and tissue donation, and I've been a patient partner in research for 15 years, mostly in the transplant, but now in other research and system transformation. Yeah, feeling out as an outsider, one of the things that were mentioned in our report was like titles. And I sort of made a joke about it when the people I was working with Canadian Transplant Donation Transplant Research Program. And so with all these acronyms, so I would say, well, mine are PSC, which is my rare liver disease, IBD, inflammatory bowel disease, SOH, sense of humor, and then CS, common sense. And they all got a laugh out of that, right? But it's like, yeah, it's sort of like what we bring to the table. And, you know, I've come a long way. I mean, like, so I've had some really good experience lately, but I remember my calls as being a co-lead on Team 5 of the CDTRP, which is long-term outcomes. And we would have these meetings and everyone would talk, and a lot of them were on Zoom, right? Because it was a time. And so, you know, sometimes I would try to say something, but I said, you know, I think it's really important that everyone be introduced. And I asked my co-lead, who was a pediatric a doctor, I said, in transplant, I said, I think maybe it's important that you introduce me and indicate that I'm a patient partner and that, you know, we should listen to the voices of the patient partner and understand where I'm coming from. And I've seen that a lot of times where you'll join a meeting, you don't know who anyone is, and then you're trying to understand. And then I remember being on a meeting with the government, but not knowing who the players were. But then there's one woman was like talking like, you know, she was in control of everything, but had no idea who she was. So like moving forward, you know, we started asking like, one of the things we're doing as part of the PAN is working with Canadian Digital Health Research, Health Evaluation. And what we started to do is do bios before meeting up on a project. But these bios also include fun things, like fun facts about us. What do we like to do for hobbies? You know, who we are as individuals, and then our picture, more than focus on our academic things. And also, I really find it interesting that if a researcher has lived experience, right, then they're considered more qualified than someone who just has the patient experience and not the research background. But I challenge that in some ways because I think that they come with a bias. And I also think it's important to include people that don't have that hat so that they don't have to worry about separating it. So those are the areas that I wanted to point out based on what was read today. Thank you.
So thanks so much, Sandra and Annette. So I'm going to switch over to our three very brave researcher panelists, and I'm going to start with an easy question just because, you know, that's how you put people at ease. So don't worry, the tough ones are coming up later. So they'll introduce themselves when they first speak, but I'm going to ask Stuart, Ambreen, and then Manoj. And I would just ask them to say, you know, you're all researchers who have a good deal of experience in patient-partnered research. was there anything in the survey findings that was surprising to you? So Stuart, we'll start with you.
Great, thank you. So I'm Stuart. I'm the bloke from England, as I mentioned myself, but I'm a researcher here in Ottawa. Really sort of came to this through sort of interest in sort of how policy ethics are sort of experienced in the real world. That's sort of how I've come to this and why I'm sort of working this space. I think for me, one of the things that was interesting and perhaps, you know, sometimes we work in a bit of a bubble, right? I assume everybody's doing patient engagement. We work in a space where that's what we do, and actually seeing that that's not the case, you know, we think maybe we're moving on, and maybe we see that actually that's not necessarily the general experience or the general thing. So we still have work to do. I think that was perhaps most interesting or perhaps novel to me. And a reality check for me as well, in terms of sort of, okay, maybe we're not quite where I thought we were.
Thanks, Stuart. Ambreen?
Hi, everyone. My name is Ambreen. I'll introduce myself, I guess, a little bit through my social location. And a social location is essentially a position you occupy in society based on different degrees of advantage or disadvantage that you have. So you can tell by looking at me, I'm a female, I'm a person of color, I'm described as a visible minority. What you can't tell by looking at me is that I immigrated to Canada, so I'm a settler on this land, and that puts you many steps back before you can have a couple of steps forward. I'm also sandwiched between caring for my kids and 4 aging parents between my spouse and I. But I also hold degrees of advantage. So I'm a trained physician. I trained in surgical oncology. I lead a research program that's focused on improving the ways in which we engage with the public. And I work a lot with Elise. So, you know, there are many ways in which we've thought together about a lot of these issues. So did anything surprise me? To be honest, I found it really validating to see that the ways in which we're asking research questions in my lab, the challenges that we're trying to solve for are really there and are as important as we feel they are. If I were to describe a picture that came to my mind, it's the classic sense of an ivory tower of academia and people trying to get to the top in order to be able to contribute to science. But from my perspective, science should really live in the communities that we're seeking to serve. So thank you for doing the work, Pan, and for validating things which I think I already understood existed, but have given it tangible voice in numbers and quotes.
Thanks, Ambreen. Manoj?
Hi, thanks, Maureen, and thanks for the invitation to speak on this panel with you. And in terms of introduction, Manoj Lalu, I'm born and raised in Edmonton. I think some of you might be from out west. I actually moved to Ottawa about 15 years ago to start my anesthesia training. I'm an anesthesiologist half the week and a researcher the other half the week, and full-time parent all the time. So in terms of what surprised me, what I really liked and what resonated with that report was actually a diagram that Ali's put up as well too, where you had the macro and the meso and the micro. So macro being the funder, meso being our SPOR units, and research networks are in there as well, and the micro being our research teams. And this is something we had been thinking about, and we're trying to figure out how to basically get some of the networks and the SPOR units more on board with some of the work that we're doing. And I know Maureen's going to ask me a little bit more about that in one of the questions. So I'll tell you more details about some of that work in a moment. But I think it put into a visual and also into words exactly what one of the issues that we need to tackle is, which is how do we align all these people, right? So how do we align funders who put forth a lot of the money that makes patient engagement and research happen? How do we align them more with the SPOR units and what the research networks are doing? And then what's happening on the micro level, these research teams can be quite different as well too, right? So I think in order to address a lot of the barriers and issues that have been raised, I think we do need alignment, and it was such a perfect diagram. I really like that.
Thank you, Manoj. And just a reminder, everyone's welcome to put questions in the chat at any point, and we will either address them live if we can, by someone will answer them, or we'll put them into the question and answer period. Okay, that was great. Now I'm going to ask each of our researchers a specific question that will reflect some of the areas that they're working in. So, Ambreen, you engage with people who have often been excluded from research partnerships, sometimes people partnering for the first time. How does this outsider syndrome show up in your settings, and how do you mitigate this?
That's a very interesting question, I think, particularly because to feel, and correct me if I'm wrong, Elise, Annette, and Sandra, but to feel like an outsider, you would have had to have been in those rooms a couple of times. And so for people who aren't aware that research can include the public, or perhaps even goes a few steps back, understand the research ecosystem, the fact that it can improve the ways in which they access care, the direct linkage between their everyday lives and research. Sometimes even that isn't apparent. But the onus of that isn't on community. It's really on us and how we raise awareness about the entire research ecosystem, what we're trying to solve for as a research community overall, and then a research community in the health system. And then have those relationships in community to say, would you be interested, or what are the topics of interest to you? I think the outsider syndrome perhaps is more common when people have been in those rooms and perhaps been invited to rooms that weren't designed for them in the first place. So the ways in which I think I preempt for this and try to mitigate for this, and I can't say I've solved for this by any means, but it's a very conscious effort of meeting people where they're at, talking to them about their everyday lived experiences. It's what a patient partner who I work with describes as drinking those 100 cups of tea. You just sit with people and you build those relationships. And literally the conversation is about tea in everyday lives. And then the ideas seem to form a thematic evolution. So those are the things that we think are important. Oh, so how should we think about those more collaboratively? Is that a problem we think should be solved? And so it's a very organic process of bringing people in by meeting them where they're at. So it's not really bringing them in. I'm going in and we're deciding where they are. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's how I tend to approach it.
Absolutely does, and thank you for that. Very thought-provoking. So Manoj, in the area of engagement where you specialize, and you'll be able to tell us that, is this outsider syndrome more prevalent? So can you share a best practice to help mitigate this?
Right. So I alluded to it a little bit in my first answer there, but our area of focus right now in terms of patient engagement is how do we actually incorporate people with lived and living experience into more preclinical or laboratory-based research. So that's at the, often we're talking about patient engagement in clinical research or in policy or guideline development. This is way on the left end of that spectrum of research because we're talking about things that are just at the genesis of an idea. And we're often thinking about new therapies or new targets to develop medications for instance. So it's very, very different area. And I think the outsider syndrome is definitely prevalent there. I mean, we haven't quantified it obviously, but I like your report again because I think it starts to put some words to some things that we've observed. So I'd say first of all, in our area of patient engagement, lots of people haven't even thought about this, right? So and we're talking about very senior investigators who are well-funded through federal funds as well too. So I think that culture is not even thinking about patient engagement in many ways. And I often use myself as an example. This is many years ago. This is a bit of ancient history, but I did my PhD before entering medicine, excuse me. And I was in the lab and I studied sepsis, which is life-threatening infections. And I never actually met a person with a lived experience of sepsis. I never set foot in an ICU, intensive care unit, where patients who have sepsis are generally taken care of as well too. So it hadn't even crossed my mind, because it wasn't part of the culture, right? And we still see that today. So I think, of course, yes, outsider syndrome is there because we meaning basic scientists and preclinical researchers, aren't even really thinking about this. But we're changing that, which is great, with lots of help with with many of you that are on the panel as well too, which is great. So in terms of best practice, just to wrap that up, I think what you've pointed in the report is key in terms of starting to foster these relationships and starting to think about how do we actually implement patient engagement in this space, and that is actually making the time and space for that relationship to begin, right? So I think, and I think in your wording, in your report was something along the lines of it's the foundation. It truly is, right? So you don't just jump into the first session saying, okay, this is the cell line I'm talking about, and this is this particular protein we're interested in. I think you got to back up for a minute and just talk about yourselves, as you've already pointed to as being a key aspect in making this work. I'll stop there though.
So would I be right in assuming that had I had a conversation with you 10 or 15 years ago, you would not have envisioned that one day you'd be a leader in patient engagement in preclinical research?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. How's that?
Okay,
So,
that's a good lesson for people
yeah.
who are early career researchers. Watch where your career may end up and be open to it. So that's great. Thanks, Manoj. So Stuart, you have a really interesting perspective also as a researcher, but also as a person who spends a good deal of time advising research teams on patient engagement. So what is your advice on dealing with this issue of outsider syndrome?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the things we've already done today can help. Obviously meeting people outside of the research question, having those conversations person to person, not as I'm the PI, here's my research project, can you tell me how to do X, Y, or Z? I think a lot of my general advice is sort of very, very simple. It's like, don't ask me, ask the person you're working with. I get questions like, what author affiliation should I use for this person, or how should I do this? And I'm like, this is something that the individual you're working with, you need to have a conversation with them about that. How would they like to be referred to? How would they like to be included? Ask them how this would work for them. What their life situation is in terms of how you can make it more feasible and help them to be part of the research team. So, I often have resources and give people resources that have been developed by others. I think that's a thing we actually really need to look at in this space, actually, is we're very good at building new things. We seem to have lots and lots of new things, and actually using the things we have is where actually a lot of the challenge is. And so part of my role is actually not to create new things, it's actually to find good resources and start to share them, hopefully get people to use them. But as I say, it's not really about me being the answer. It's about sort of directing people and getting people to think about, okay, how do you have that conversation? Go and have that conversation with the people you want to work with.
That's a very powerful message, Stuart, and the humility in that is something that really appeals to patient partners to hear that. You've already got some people with expertise, talk to them, right? Okay, I'm going to hand it back over to Annette, Sandra, and Elise. And, since your report pointed to those cultural challenges and the power imbalances that can contribute to this outsider syndrome, I was hoping to hear from you, and I'm going to limit you to one best practice just so that we can get through all the questions. A best practice that would address either the power imbalance or the cultural challenge. So what in your experience have you seen work really well and to achieve the opposite of outsider syndrome and send the message that you're an insider? I'm going to start with Annette, then Sandra, and Elise.
All right. One thing that has made me feel like an ultimate insider has been being a reviewer, but that's not part of the patient engagement process exactly. So I really like being involved in the discussions before the first draft and around the first draft when the team gets together and discusses issues and observations. That whole building at the bottom of at the beginning of the research is very important to me. And in a scoping review once, I didn't even realize how they came up with keywords at the time. But maybe the keywords that one group of people would think up to answer a certain research question would not totally overlap the keywords that another group of people would consider. And so I think that's part of making it richer.
Thanks, Annette. Sandra?
One thing. Okay, well, one was taken. Thanks, Annette. I think it's important that patient partners can come with a collective voice. So I said I'm part of the transplant community. So when I come, I can speak from my experience, but I can also speak from many others who have shared, or what I've learned by being a part of groups like PAN, where you're meeting other people and like that. Also, too, just going to add one thing about how our feedback is being used, right? I must have said that, like, I don't know if I'm making an impact, or I don't know how well I'm doing. And I only could judge it based on the fact that I kept getting invited back to things. But now, fortunately, I do have people that have reached out and said, thanks for this. This is how we're going to use it. I think that's very important to, provide feedback throughout the research project and to keep patient partners in the loop.
Thanks, Sandra. Elise?
3 and 1.
Okay, so I want to go to the sort of the cultural thing because I love the practical tips from and suggestions from Annette and Sandra. What I'm going to add to it is the understanding of who we are as human beings and the privilege that we bring to the table and the assumptions that underlie everything that we do. Flushing those to the surface is so important if you're going to reach across cultural divides. And on the other side of that is not only acknowledging one's own privilege and where you're coming from. I'm, for instance, white, female, educated, and have always lived in an urban environment. I know diddly squat about rural environments, for instance. But asking others, your counterparts, where do you see this issue? How do you see this issue? What about you makes you see this issue differently from me? I think that understanding of each other's assumptions is really important. And in terms of tools, I'm going to shamelessly talk about our power wheel that Ambreen Sayani and I, with others, created. It's a good way to interrogate power imbalances and to understand place where your project or your interest lies, whether it's in the micro level, meso level, or macro level, i.e. national. The space, and this is important to understand whether, as a patient partner, am I closed out of the space? Am I invited into the space? Or have I had the ability to co-create the space? And then finally, what's the degree of influence? So that power wheel is a good tool to sort of interrogate aspects of power and just understand it. So to net out what I just said, because I'm sure I left some people in the dust, it's really a question of looking at the underlying assumptions and what about your background and who you are forms those assumptions, and how is that different from the people that you are working with and that you are going to serve. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Elise. Okay, I have a question for the researchers, and I'm not going to, as many as want to respond are open to do so, and then I'm going to ask Elise, Annette, and Sandra if they wish to kind of respond to what they're going to hear from the researchers. So, we're talking about collaborations, we're talking about partnerships. Well, the reality is that we will sometimes having seemingly conflicting perspectives. That's the beauty of perspectives. They can be different, and that can cause a lot of tension. So in the report, one of the points was about training on relationship building and ways to co-problem solve through seemingly conflicting perspectives. And I would love to hear, this is an honest assessment, an honest response from our researchers about conflict and about conflicting conflicting perspectives and how they have dealt with it, or how they even, what does that, how does that impact them and their work? And I know that Elise and Sandra and Annette will be listening very closely, and ask you to maybe respond to that. I think it would be, it's a topic that we tend to avoid sometimes because conflict is sometimes easier to avoid, but let's just put it out on the table and hear from you. So who's the brave soul who's going to go first? I don't see them unmuting. Come on. Oh, Stuart, my savior. Go ahead, Stuart.
Yeah, so I'll preface this by saying I've not been in a situation where there's been open conflict and hostility between parties. Okay, so it's not that sort of conflict that I think, obviously there are different perspectives in terms of what matters, how important certain things are, those sorts of things. I've heard stories about, well, we did this and it didn't work, so this shouldn't be done. That we kind of went with what they said. And I think for me, and again, we do this from everything from sort of when we try and advise people, researchers. So again, a lot of the work that I get brought in on is helping people who've sort of maybe already got a research idea, right? So a lot of that work is already been. So again, I want to acknowledge that whole piece about research questions, development, priority setting. I think that's a huge space where we need to do more work. I think it's probably one of the areas where we don't have as much co-development, despite it being right there from the start with SPOR. I think it's the area that's hardest, or seems to be the hardest to sort of work on. And I think there are, again, cultural reasons from everything from sort of scientists getting into that role because of the pursuit of intellectual curiosity is why they got into that. So they want to pursue things of interest to them, to, more practical limitations around timing and funds and all those sorts of things that we can talk about. But in terms of back to your question, I think honesty and transparency are the sort of two pieces. And I think that goes to a lot of the SPOR principles, I think it's about, for me, it's about having a discussion about saying, okay, these are the parameters I'm kind of working in. We need a validated measure of this, or we have these things about scientific rigor we need to follow. But then also then saying, okay, what to Ailey's point, what's the conversation here? What's the perspective you're bringing? It's that mutual respect that we have in the SPOR principles for me, and having that dialogue where we had this with. I'll give you an example. We looked at a particular study, and one of we were looking at what are the outcomes to measure, right? What are the outcomes that are important? And pain was one of the things that was raised as particularly important. But we looked at the measures, and it was like none of these actually really captured what was important to the patient partners. It was like visual analog scale 1 to 10, how bad's your pain? It's like, well, this doesn't tell you whether does my pain ruin my day? Is it so bad it completely throws off the rest of my day? So we had this conversation about, well, okay, how's this going to work? The researchers sort of said, we need something that's been used in the literature. We need something that's kind of adopted. We need something that's got some evidence behind it. So we kind of worked together to say, okay, what are the tools that are out there? And then we work together to say, okay, this is probably the best one that satisfies your need, is close to what we as patient partners are wanting in terms of our experience of what needs to be reflected. And we kind of, again, it was a back and forth about that. So to me, that's the important piece, and that's the change and what we need to do in terms of addressing conflict, where is sort of have that honesty and transparent dialogue, but do it in a respectful way that says, I respect your perspective, I'm listening to you, and here's where I'm coming from as well. And I think without that, we're not going to get very far, but that's really what needs to happen.
Thanks, Stuart. That was great. Manoj or Imbreen, would you like to chime in?
Manoj, up to you. Okay. Thanks, Stuart, for laying those pieces out. I think the relational piece is just so important, because if you have a relationship, it's far less about conflict, but more about dialogue. So can we have a conversation about this? And very often you don't even need to say you have a conversation about it. There's spaces there, and you're talking about different perspectives, but people are comfortable enough to talk about them and come up with a solution. And I can give you one or two what might be considered thorny issues. So for example, I partner with many people in my lab, but then when you look at a grant and the grant conference budget, it's like $5,000. Like, okay, how do we even decide as a group which patient partner will go? Because $5,000 honestly doesn't even cover us anymore. Like, how are we going to work around this budget to say one person will go and present with a patient partner? So it's a problem I bring back to the group. Like, this is the budget line, and we are 8 people. So clearly not everybody can go, and we have a discussion about it. So some people will say, well, actually, I'm not interested in going at all. Or how about we just send our videos instead of all of us going, so you folks can actually go to 2 conferences and include us as videos. So it's about having ongoing spaces for dialogue. It's about being transparent about the issues. Like, I'm not hiding the fact that I have $5,000 and I'm going to reach out to one person and say, hey, you know, you should come and only we're going to go. So it's being proactive, I think. And I can't say I've solved for all of these issues. I think there's a ton of work to do. And the system and structures don't always support us very well. And they do, if we talk about where conflict is coming from, it's coming from the systems and structures that we need to deal with, but we need to pull them out in the open and have space for dialogue.
Thanks, Ambreen. Manoj?
Yeah, I was just thinking about a sort of practical approach we've taken. I saw one of the comments, or I can't remember, I can't see who it is right now, but they said something about the silence that sort of accompanies this, and the silence is mistaken for consensus, which it may not be when you're in a group working together with patient partners and researchers. So one way we've tried to address this, which I think has worked well, we had a project where we had a panel of patient partners. It was a systematic review on a particular therapy for stroke. And all of these patient partners had a lived or living experience of stroke. So throughout this project, which was actually over the course of a year, we had monthly meetings as well to sort of track our progress through the systematic review together. In 3 points, we actually sent out the PPET survey, which is an evaluation tool. It's widely used, and in terms of addressing both the researchers and the patient partners, their perspectives on how things are going, basically. And we got some really surprising feedback in the first couple, especially surprising because we didn't realize that there were some misunderstandings as to, you know, what we were trying to do together. And these are misunderstandings from the researcher side and misunderstandings from the patient partner side as well, too. So I think by actually giving that space where they didn't have to necessarily speak out in, you know, within this large group of people, right? They had an opportunity to write down their thoughts and share them with us privately. This gave a space for them to provide this more honest and open feedback, and we were able to address these. And I think we were able to address them relatively successfully, because our final evaluation using that tool at the very end of the project was overwhelmingly positive in terms of both researcher and patient partner perspectives on what we had accomplished.
Thanks, Manoj. Okay, lovely Pan people. Any reactions to what you heard there? I'm just going to unmute first on watch out. Sandra.
Yeah, I'll go with what Manjo was saying at the end there. I think it's important that we're building relationships, and that patient partners, you know, I think we appreciate hearing what the barriers are in research. I think the more that we know what they are, for example, like for me, I think CIHR should make patient partnering as part of the grant, but I'm hearing that's not being done. So then how is we as patient partners advocate for that? I'll also go with what Ambreen said. Very often, you know, when the presentations are being done, you said there's a $5,000 budget. Well, there should be more, because we see the knowledge translation part being the researcher's work gets published. Sometimes we're fortunate to be a co-author on that research, which I would sometimes ask for instead of pay sometimes. But it's sad when we can't get access to that report. But then also, I've been at many conferences where a patient partner has co-presented with a researcher. And I think the impact is amazing. I don't think patient partners just want to travel just to travel. It takes a lot out of us and things like that. But I think that when a presentation is done in co-design with the researcher and patient partner, I think it shows an impact to those in the audience that says, wow, this is good. And how can I do that? And so we need to work on having a more open conversation of what the barriers are, and then how we can work together to advocate to make those changes in the system so that we can change this shift that we're talking about. And many people who have worked with patient partners, they know it's excellent. And many patient partners working with researchers that get this, it works out great. So, we work together to advocate for the changes that we need to see done.
Thanks, Sandra. Okay, and Elise.
I don't have a huge amount to offer beyond what my colleagues said, but I will say that one thing that really struck me is that there are really systemic issues that are causing problems not only for us as patient caregiver partners, but also for researchers in terms of what they're trying to do and how they're trying to do it. So I think that one of the things we need to do is maybe get together and see if we can't find some suggested solutions that we can put forward and then, if you will, lobby for to sort of make it more easeful. So that's one observation I'll make from what our three researchers on the panel have said. The other thing is that being honest about those things is helpful to those of us who are partnering, because otherwise we feel shut down for no good purpose if we're just sort of told, sorry, these are the only people who are going to the conference. Doesn't cut the mustard if we don't understand that part of the problem is the budget. And then the other piece of that equation, of course, is how that decision is being made. Does it make sense? Was it made collaboratively, and so on? So I think that dealing together with the problems is much more powerful, and then finding solutions to those problems or making suggestions if they're outside our agency to those who have the power to make those changes. I think that's also very important. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Elise. Annette, did you want to chime in?
A little bit. I have found that there are things I don't know about the research process and the protocols. And so I've ended up on occasion questioning, well, why can't we change the title? Or why can't we bring out what we found out in this discussion, even though it's a review? But nobody's got time to go into those details. And obviously, as a patient partner, I took the PACER course, the Patient and Community Engagement and Research, where I did an actual piece of research in a team with Elise and Sarah. But we didn't learn what you can and can't do, and what's really rigid, and what the funders require, I suppose. And so the researcher responsibilities are a bit of a mystery in some aspects.
Thank you, Annette. I'm going to go into the final question because it's a real doozy. It's a two-part question. It's part of it is to make sure you're all still listening. So, and it deals directly with some of the things that were revealed in the report. So, so really time to be maybe a little bit more provocative and think about system challenges. So the report, refers to 3 layers of support. Just a reminder: macro, which is the system that we're all working in; meso, which is the grant fund holder, financial admin support, and the SPOR support units; and then micro, which is the research team level and the practical and procedural supports. So first part of the question is to the 3 researchers: how can we better align these 3 levels of support? But to add to the interest to it, you all work within the constraints of a research institution. And this institution, was not initially set up for patient-partnered research. This came after. So what, thinking about grant applications and funding and compensation and all those other themes. So a health research ecosystem where patient partners have become insiders requires that culture change. So how are you restricted by the current system, and what could be done to promote culture change? So a little bit about the 3 levels and how we could better align them, and then just a personal reflection on what is it that restricts you and what could potentially be done to promote that culture change. Loaded question, and I'm going to start with Ambreen.
Thanks, Maureen. This is a very interesting question, which could have been the topic of this entire panel discussion. I think Stuart, Manoj have both alluded to the structural issues that we work within. I think I want to, because this is your last question to us, I'm going to end on a higher note. So for some contextual background, I've lived and worked in over 30 countries before I came to Canada. So I've been in a ton of different institutions, and I have to say the kind of engagement work that I do right now, based out of Women's College Hospital, is really remarkable. I have been doing this work since 2020, and every time I face challenges in terms of how are patient partners compensated, are there different ways in which we can pay them, can we set up meetings differently, I need to purchase devices and I need the hospital to write them off so I can give them to people. These have been a lot of conversations that I have had, but that the hospital has been willing to have with me in return. And so we've changed some of those policies. It's actively listening to people on the ground, getting grassroots perspectives, bringing it back to the institution, having the institution understand the challenges, and then rejig some of those policies. So researchers need training, absolutely. Patient partners need training to partner in research, but institutions also need that training. We can't work without the institutions moving with us. I think the very last point that I'll add is we had an in-person event, I think it was at the end of September, where around 20 patient partners came together from my lab, and I sent the hospital VP an email saying that we're getting together. And they took out time just to come and sit with us to have those cups of tea. So it wasn't email, they knew we were meeting, and they took that time out to spend time with us. So it really is the whole culture that goes all the way. And good work that requires organizations to shift can only happen if the institution is willing to listen and shift with you, or else you're just butting heads. And I say that as a person who's been in different institutions, so I kind of know how butting heads works.
Thanks, Ambreen. Manoj?
No, I fully agree. I think the well, at all those levels, we need to have change, and I think part of it is top down. So I think the funders hold a lot of the keys. So as was already mentioned by other people on the panel, I think if there is more of a will from the top level funders to make patient engagement, and research a priority, then the dollars or the researchers will follow the dollars. The institutes will follow the dollars as well too, right? So I think that's how we operate within research. In terms of institutes, I think many of you who are online right now probably have some affiliation with a research institute, a health research institute. You could probably advocate for change, right? And for us at the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute, Stuart and I are helping, along with many other people, try to change that research culture to have patient partners more deeply embedded. One thing, just really briefly, that we're doing, we're hoping to basically pull off next month, is have patient partners invited to our annual trainee research day, which is our biggest research day for our institute. So we're trying to make that happen. And again, once people start seeing patient partners at our our spaces where typically it's only been researchers, right, and executives within our hospital and our research institute. I think that's going to be an important step.
Thanks, Manoj. Stuart?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I guess, some of the things that we've already said. So, you need someone in your institution to sort of be the champion, but you can't just have a champion, right? You have to then create the infrastructure change. So, we've been fortunate here that we've had individuals, leadership at the OHRI, so the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute and the Ottawa Hospital, who have made that campaign. And then we now have it in our strategic plan that there is ongoing institutional support for the Office for Patient Engagement and Research Activities. It's written there in our strategic plan. So should our champion leaders for some reason step away, do change, you've not lost that leadership. And I think we've probably all seen examples where there's a champion who leaves and then it all crumbles behind them because there's no one in that position. So I think for me, that's one of the biggest things is you have to have that champion, but you have to then move it from an individual to an institution or a bigger sort of level. And without that, you're so dependent on an individual that things potentially fall away. I think we also face a number of sort of competing demands across those different levels, right? So, and we've tended to operationalize some of these demands in certain ways that don't necessarily mean we don't have to do it in that particular way. I'll give an example. Open access publications. We talked about, Sandra brought up not being able to access it. But what's happened is a dominant force has been the publishers here. So we've got these what we call gold open access, these things where the researchers pay a fee. We pay to publish our own work to a multinational profit-making entity. We take government funds and give it to a profit-making entity in most cases. This might astound you, but we had a paper that's been accepted in the British Medical Journal. We have an incentive to publish in journals that have high impact. So we want our work to have impacts. We publish those places where it does. The British Medical Journal, a very good journal, if we want to make our paper open access, it's 10,000 Canadian dollars for a PDF, effectively. I mean, it's ridiculous. So we're having these demands on one hand where our funder is saying you need to make your work open access, but it's become perversely taken in a direction that supports these profit-making entities. And we can course correct. There are self-archiving abilities where we can put the version of our paper, but we've been pushed in a certain direction. So I think those are the challenges. And we have other things like the the relationship building that was talked about earlier. We want to keep relationships across projects, not just to end of a project, but at the same time, we don't want to exclude new voices. So you're trying to keep relationships going, but not exclude new voices, other voices that want to come in. So I think we face a lot of these sorts of tensions, and we still need to work through how do we best resolve some of those tensions.
I'm just going to ask you a follow-up question, Stuart. So, myself as a person who's been involved for a number of years, I've watched researchers, do all the work to get a grant application in. And I have had the privilege of being a co-applicant, so very involved, in that process. And of course, the best guidance is always start early, start those conversations early, make sure you get the input all the way through. But is the system set up for that? Is that realistic? So you're trying to bring all this in, and usually on no budget for that piece of it because you don't have the grant yet. Can you just, because I know that's a common issue that we have in patient engagement, is that a week before, sometimes a day before, can you support this? Is there something that can be done about that, Stuart? And I know groups have offered grants that you can apply for to get the beginning work done. So is that occurring often enough? And I know you support a lot of teams on their patient engagement piece of their grant application. So just would love to hear from you on that.
Yeah, so I think there's a continuum here in terms of what people are like in terms of grants. And it, again, I think for me, things like the CHR project grants, which are highly predictable, tend to be the ones where you get a bit of more running because everybody knows, right? This is when it's happening. Not always, but generally. I think sometimes it's the ones where people find out late or things like that. I think yeah, sometimes it can be better to say, sorry, it's too late. I think sometimes people need to hear that. I think it's hard to say, particularly if it's a really important topic and something you feel strongly about. I think it's hard to do that, but sometimes that needs to be said. In terms of the last point, though, the budget, I think there are good reasons why people may struggle, for example, for compensation and honoraria for that. I think other times, so again, I don't know how well this is, I might be giving away trade secrets here, but you know, when scientists are first appointed in many institutions, they get a budget to build their team. There is some money there. You know, it may not be a lot, but generally the honoraria in the grand scheme of things isn't a lot. It's certainly less than that BMJ PDF. So I think sometimes it's a bit of a weak excuse, but there are groups, and again, some scientists, some investigators, particularly who are trying to make a start. You know, it's a challenge, and certainly for students, you know, people who don't have that funding. I will point out the OSU Capacity Partnership Development Grants. Sorry, John, I've probably given that the wrong title, but you know, there are pockets of funding like that that do support the provision of honoraria for patient partners in that development space. So there is funding, and maybe that's somewhere we need to do a better job, is actually helping people find those pockets of funding and space there. So I don't know if I've said too much, but I'll be quiet.
We said honest and frank, and you're making it real. Embreen, did you quickly want to comment on that?
Yes, and I just want to say that funders are listening to us. So call me the optimist on today's panel, but I will say that funders are listening. I received a Canadian Cancer Society Health Equity grant last year, and it was in 2 phases. So phase 1 was just $8,000. You had to give in 2 pages of application, but they gave you $8,000 if you were successful in phase 1, and that was to build a team and to write the grant, and you got a 6-month runway. And then you applied for phase 2. So they're listening, the funders are listening. To Elisa's point, maybe we need to, you know, coalesce more around these issues, bring them on the radar, and we'll have more effect.
Thanks, Embreen. Okay, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to wrap it up in 1 sentence, and then I'm going to turn it over to Stuart for a surprise announcement. So one of the goals is really to break down silos. You know, the silo with the insiders and the silos with the outsiders. And I think we may have put a chip in it, but just a little chip. A lot of work needs to be done. So Stuart is going to announce a new program that we hope will continue to work in that area. We're also really looking forward to, at the end of the question period, your webinar experience survey. What did you think of this format? What did you think of this open and frank discussion with no slides? You know, is it something you would attend again? So really, there's nothing that I could say that could possibly add to what these 6 panelists have brought to this discussion. Brilliant and lots of food for thought. So I'm gonna hand it over to Stuart to make a very important announcement, and then I'm going to go right into the question and answer period. So over to you, Stuart. And Tiffany,
Thanks, Maureen. And Maureen should take a lot of credit for this as well. So recognizing the need for this sort of ongoing dialogue, bringing people together, we've been working with the support of OSU to sort of think through this. And what we're planning is what we're calling the sort of OSU World Cafe conversations. The idea is to bring people together in a sort of less structured format like this, to have discussions on those topics that are really important. And so we'll circulate information in due course about how you can get involved, but we'll be having a sort of asynchronous or online sort of discussion board where we'll be soliciting your ideas, topics that you want to discuss, and then we'll be taking those forward into sort of more dialogue events where we can actually have a discussion on those topics that have been identified. And so that's our plan going forward. As I say, we'll be obviously trying to work out the schedule and how often these will be happening, but check your social medias and the OSU website and newsletters going forward, but we'll be sharing more information about that in due course.
Hey, thank you, Stuart. I'm going to go right to the questions. I'm going to start with one that's in the chat from Francine. Francine, do you want to unmute and actually ask it in real time? Oh, maybe she's gone. Oh, she may have left for another meeting. Okay, so we'll take one from someone who's actually here. We'll have to get back to Francine later. So I'm looking through the chat, but while I'm looking through there, does anyone have a question that they'd like to unmute and ask our panelists? Lots of discussion in there. Okay, I'm taking a look. I'm trying to see all of the, let me see here. See everyone. I don't see anyone yet. Whoops. I don't see any hands up. Okay, so let me look through the chat. I should have been marking the times. Lots of comments about people responding to what they're hearing. Well, I think I'm going to ask Francine's question. It's a really good question. So here we go. I'm going to get down here. Sorry about that, guys. I'm a little bit slow here. Lots of comments. Oh, here we go. Okay. So from Francine, how do we shift the culture to seeing engagement as a collective voice instead of anecdotal without becoming qualitative research? Anybody would like to answer that question? Elise.
Her hand up.
Yeah.
Yes,
Elise.
I'd love to answer that question because I think it's an excellent one and one that we have tackled to some degree in PAN and continue to do so. We engage with different organizations and research groups as a collective where we have a model where we provide 2 lead patient caregiver partners because it's best practice to have 2. We're all patients and caregivers, so we could be knocked off our keister and not be able to continue. And we support our 2 leads with a council of roughly 2 to 4 other people who do almost all of the same work and support the leads who are faced to the project team. And then behind that, if it warrants it, we have the PAN community and our larger network that we can draw on to build sort of a real collective voice. We've done this now for 7 years, and we found it incredibly useful and valuable from our perspective because we know we're not talking at the voice of one, we're talking at the voice of many, based on our own experiences. So I'll just leave it at that. And Sandra, you've been part of it, so has Annette. If you want to make any further comments to that, that would be great.
Yeah, I find that any kind of patient partner, you should always have a minimum of 2. What PAN is doing is way above that, and I think it's excellent. It works really great. So Annette and I are one, and we're the 2 patient partner leads. But then we have others that are going to be back up on it as well and keep in the loop. But it's also the way the report that we began with at the beginning was done, and that was excellent, right? So many
it's
voices.
Q&A, so I can quit.
Okay, goodbye. And then like there's the survey that had 262 people, right? And I mentioned it too, is about being part of the transplant community. Like you hear other stories, right? So, and then just being part of the transplant community, also long-term outcomes. Many of us have complications, right? Mental health, diet, nutrition, physical therapy. sleep problems, et cetera, et cetera. And these are all the things that we bring to the table.
That's really interesting, Sandra. I'm going to comment on that. It's a discussion that goes on all the time, right? Do two people represent patients? And they don't. But people can be providing perspectives that are different according to their lived experience. And the example that I'll give is that I will be finishing in a couple of months almost 12 years on Ontario's Committee to Evaluate Drugs. In the early years of that, we received a lot of patient input because we were redoing everything after the then CADIV. So I've read over 100 patient input reports where people were saying why they wanted the drug, why it was important to them, what values are important to them. So that's in me. Like I carry that with me. So I can sometimes provide a very personal perspective of my experience with the system, but some of us also carry perspectives that we've heard from other people. I've been in this 25 years and I've heard all kinds of people say all kinds of things in those 25 years. I try to bring that to me because I'm not working in my disease area. I have luckily a treatment now and it's ultra rare. There's no further research happening. So does that mean that I don't participate in patient or in patient partnered research? No, it means that, but I have a chronic health condition. I rely on the health system. So when you look at your patient partners, you have to kind of look at them each individually and say, what is this person bringing to the table? And what does this person bring to the table? And the value of the person who's focused on one thing is just as important as the value of the person who maybe has a wider perspective. And bringing all those together is really important. So I like Francine's question about this collective voice, because we're bringing different voices, and they really are based on how we've lived the healthcare system and the privileges that we've had to hear other people talk about the healthcare system. And do we take that to heart, and do we try to bring that to and share that with researchers? So that was I took my prerogative as moderator there. Sorry, guys. I have to say something. I'm not the type of person who I kind of like to talk. So there you go. I wanted to just add that to that great question that Francine asked, because sometimes people try to put us in boxes and say, this person brings this person brings that. We have to kind of be open to what it is that we can actually bring to your team. And Bree.
And I'll just add that perspective is even more important when you're engaging with people that have been harmed by the system. Elise and I can talk about the numbers of times we've received emails saying, we want a pink, orange, purple person, you do diversity work, so can you link us to a patient partner who falls in those check boxes as you described? But collective voice becomes a way of ensuring safety within a group when you have people who trust each other and have relationships rooted in trust. Then their collective voice is actually much more meaningful to provide inputs into different projects. And we've, kind of operationalized that. It's not just a vision or an ideal. We have operationalized that through the impact model. And multiple times we've asked the group, we get requests for different projects. Would you like us to pass it to you so you can, participate in different projects? They're like, nope, we want to stay as a group. We don't want to participate as individuals in different projects. And Elise and I have found that so powerful over the years that they choose not to split.
That's great, Embry. Okay. The first thing I want to do is thank our 6 panelists. Just planning for this session was an incredible amount of fun. Our big call that we had with all of us together, I thought, oh, we should have taped that. That could have been the webinar, because we talked about so many important things. I'm hoping that we did manage to take that deeper dive into the outsider syndrome, and that would be, that would be great. We need to take deeper dives into all kinds of syndromes. What I'm really encouraged about OSSU is that moving forward, they're embracing their role in promoting patient-oriented research by continuing to do the training, patient engagement 101 needs to be done over and over again because there's new people coming in to the system all the time, and we need to welcome them and we need to provide them training, but they're also embracing their role in advancing the research by taking some deeper dives into some of the issues that have arisen over the past 11 years and embracing that part of their role too, which I think is really, really important. And so hopefully that we'll see you at the World Cafe Conversations. What I'm going to do is, so just thank you to our panelists. You absolutely spoke from the heart. It was heartfelt, and to our three lovely panelists who have just added so much to this conversation, and keep up the good work. And I just want to again thank everyone. Thank all of you for coming. I know there's webinars every hour of the day, and you've got to pick and choose. We're all busy people, and the questions were great, and we hope that we will be able to continue these frank discussions. And big thank you to OSSU for supporting this, for letting this be completely patient-led. I can assure you that we were patient-led. We had John Riley's incredible support with his run of the show and everything else, and of course Vasanti and Carolyn, who have, just are committed to doing this kind of work. We're really grateful for that. And have a great rest of your day. And thank you so much, everyone.